Hello, patient KSP fans. This is Almoran. It was over 6 weeks ago that I promised that I would refly this mission and post the whole video. For 2 weeks I procrastinated. I played DCS, I played 2048, I watched reruns of Game of Thrones and did anything to avoid redoing this mission. And then finally, about 4 weeks ago, I started recording bits and pieces of it. I ended up with nearly 600 gigabytes of footage comprising about 6.5 hours. Here's some of that footage, and here's some more, and here's some more, and I've cut down as best I could to about 45 minutes. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, this is the first launch of a new career in KSP. This is a tier 0 parts only ship, and we are going to go and max out the entire tech tree in a single launch. Now, because I actually recorded this mission over about 8 or 9 hours, involving about 15 or 20 different sittings, you might hear the audio quality shift as I use a headset mic. I tried to smooth it out in post as much as I could, but I was also editing this for about 12 hours to get it all together. So if you're not happy with the change in pitch in the commentary, I'm sorry, I can't really do anything about that. And I'll get to a couple of other video features in a moment. But first, let's just talk about the ship. The ship is the Cinder Block 2. The construction video for the Cinder Block and the techniques used to get it to work on tier 0 parts is another video on my channel, which you can see if you'd like to. And I'm about to start transferring fuel from the platform to the 3 ships that the Cinder Block has. Jeb, Bob and Bill are all going to be performing missions here. Now, to separate those 3 ships, I'm using a slightly different technique from previously. Instead of overheating SRBs, I'm going to destroy an FLT-200 using 2 LVT-30s. And the advantage of this is that the LVT-30s drain from that tank and that tank only, so they're not draining fuel from the ships themselves, which gives me a little extra delta V. And you can see they also don't go flying off into a different trajectory or a different orbit, which is nice. So this is Bill leaving low Kerbin orbit to go to the moon, and if you look at the top left, you can see who is on screen, where they've most recently been, and what their next objective is. That will hopefully help you keep track. It certainly helped me as I edited this video and put it together. And Bill is going to take a Munna flyby or a Munna slingshot on his way to Minmus, as you can see here, which widens his apoapsis, giving him a lower relative velocity intercept and therefore a smaller insertion burn. And of course a nice polar orbit, so we can loop around and pick up as many biomes as possible on Minmus. Now, the landing site I'm going for here is in the middle of what I know from the previous time I flew this mission, is about 5 or 6 different biomes that you can get to on the EVA pack alone. And so you'll see after I land, I'm gonna, well, I didn't actually video myself collecting all the science because that's kind of tedious, but I will have flags all over the surface here. You can go about 30 kilometers if you're wondering on EVA, on the EVA pack if you're on Minmus. And what I'm doing right now, although the first little hop wasn't very efficient, but there are 3 biomes all very close together here, and I want to get an extra crew report because you need to be in the command pod to transmit a crew report. So I decided to transport the command pod, the whole ship, therefore, to these 3 biomes to get these extra crew reports. But to get the final biomes on Minmus, I've got all but I think 1 here, and I'm going to have to perform a bit of a flight over to the far left of screen there. There'll be a set of flats that I don't have biome information for. So by carrying 2 command pods, I can take 2 surface samples. I also thought I needed 2 command pods in order to get 2 EVA reports, but apparently in 0.22 or 0.23 EVA reports were made a one-shot deal. So maybe I didn't need the 2 command pods, but the extra surface sample certainly makes it worthwhile, and it also means that every time I do a burn, especially a landing or an ascent burn like this, where you're firing the engine for a while, I will fill up both command pods with electricity, which is certainly helpful for transmitting those crew reports back, because with 2 command pods you can store 100 electricity instead of just 50. And there are times during this mission where energy gets pretty low, and I need that extra power. So Bill is now leaving Minmus and heading to the moon, and you saw that I'm leaving at the ascending or descending node of Minmus through the moon's plane in order to get the intercept on the far side of the orbit. And I will perform a burn here. Minmus is pretty cheap to leave from, so it's not that important as to which direction you go, but there's the result on the right of screen. And there's the Munna insertion or the Munna correction to again get a nice polar orbit, and the insertion and circularization burn. And again, I'm not going to show all this science collection because it's really, really boring. Now I'm going to land at my favorite position on the moon. It's just at the top edge of the crater there, between or right next to the crater, the canyons, the highlands are there. The highland craters can be gotten as well, and I think one other, all within EVA range, but you can't go nearly as far on your EVA pack on the moon, of course, as you can on Minmus. So after collecting this biome, I checked my fuel. Oh, of course you can EVA a little further if you do a face toboggan. But decided to fly across to the crater, and it turned out after I flew across to the crater I still had enough for another hop, so I actually flew back past my original landing site, which you'll see in a second here. Now, my landings are, well, I don't think this one's particularly good, but in general what I do is I just go to where I want to put the trajectory into the ground where I want it to be. I don't worry too much about having somewhere flat to land on, because that obviously costs extra fuel if you're floating around looking for a flat landing zone. Now, later in the mission, that that technique will come back to haunt me, but fortunately I managed to get away with it, and you might be able to imagine where I might be, where I can get away with something like a very lopsided landing. That will be Jeb, and that is much, much later in the video. Now, Bill's mission is technically complete at this point. He was off to get the biomes of Minmus and the moon, and that actually returns, as you'll see shortly, a hell of a lot of science. But after leaving, he still had a little bit of fuel left there. So instead of just returning to Kerbin and going straight in for a landing, I decided to pay a visit to Bob, because Bob is still in LKO, as is Jeb, waiting for their launch window to Eve. So a bit of a meet and greet before Bob heads in for his landing in a moment here, and because of all the biomes on the moon and Minmus, you pick up a lot of surface samples there, and I end up getting about 4,400 science. I just jump out of the capsule here and grab a couple of extra surface samples off Kerbin. It's only worth about 10 points, but why not grab them? And on recovering, I'm got 4,400 science, so you need about 10,500 to unlock the whole tree though. So off goes Bob, and Jeb is about a quarter of an orbit behind. He'll be following Bob on their way to Eve, and they're going to go for opposite gravity assists. Jeb is going to head down to Moho, and Bob is going to head up to higher altitudes. But I realized I should have put 5 fuel tanks on the core here, because I have to refuel twice to get to Eve, and later on in the video it would have been convenient to refill 4 tanks at once instead of 2 at once, because I always have 1 tank empty in the core. And the same is true of the second stage of Jeb's ship. Jeb's just using the remaining fuel from the launch platform here, because hey, Delta V is Delta V, and his ship is actually a 2-stage ship, because he's going to be going to a few more places than Bob is. But neither of them managed to make it to Eve on 1 burn, and having 4 tanks full instead of just 2 and a bit tanks full certainly would have made the timings a little bit easier, but in the end it doesn't hurt the timing too much. And so here's Jeb's trajectory past Eve. Now you can see I need to make a normal correction to get my slingshot, and I just wanted to demonstrate that the position 90 degrees around from the encounter on the left there, and the maneuver at the top of screen is the best place to make it, because if I move it anywhere else, you can see how the resultant orbit shrinks, which means I'm not getting as big of a kick off of Eve. But I actually want to go down to Moho, not Eve, so I need to shift Jeb's trajectory to the other side of Eve here, which I'll do with a little radial burn. And we're about to break into a bit of live commentary. You'll see the indicator on the top left of screen. So take it away, Almiran. And I'm still not all the way down to Moho, but I don't want to burn to Moho, because that little bit of altitude that I have there is actually going to cost me quite a lot of Delta V to fix. That is, let's just have a look, 204 meters per second prograde. That's more than I want to spend. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is make a second pass at Eve another orbit around. Now, again, the reason why that was not very efficient, if I add a prograde maneuver here, yes, I'm adding velocity that reduces my solar velocity, but I'm also bending this escape trajectory further away from solar retrograde, right? As if I add prograde velocity here, see how that bends out? And bending that out means it's bending further away in this direction, whereas I really want to bend it further in this direction to become closer to solar retrograde. So live commentary is commentary performed as I played the game, because I thought I was doing something that required a bit more detailed explanation, and we'll jump into some more of that in a second here for Bob. Now, Bob is going to go up to higher altitudes. I'm going to send him to Dres. My Eve slingshot, with the same kind of normal correction as I made for Jeb, has gotten me up to nearly all the way to Duna. What I want to do, therefore, is get a second slingshot, and the second slingshot I'm going to want to get off Kerbin. So here's the big question. How do you chain slingshots together? Well, right now, this green dotted line represents my post-Eve orbit, and I've set Kerbin as my target. And you can see that they're not quite crossing. That's very hard to see because the inclination difference is small. But in order for me to have an intercept with Kerbin, the point where this line needs to cross in this plane has to be the same as in this plane, right, in the horizon, which means that the ascending or descending node must come around to one of these 2 points where my orbit line moves outside and then back inside Kerbin's orbit line. You can see I very nearly have an intercept with Kerbin already, but I can't quite get that cheaply. So what I'll do is plan to get an intercept at this orbit intersection here, this crossing point. So I set my maneuver, and I put my 90-degree around position. Now the first thing I want to do is move this descending or ascending node around to be exactly at this point. And the way I'm going to do that is by very slightly tweaking my trajectory past Eve. So let's change that very, very slightly here. As you can see how the ascending and descending node are moving around as I make these very tiny changes. I want to get one of them right here. Now, where am I post-Eve, and where is Kerbin going to be post-Eve? Well, there's the target position, and there's me, so obviously nowhere near this point. So let's look a couple more orbits ahead. One orbit ahead, and they're already pretty close together. So good and bad things about that. First of all, it means I'm not going to be waiting very long, because it's only one orbit ahead, but it also means that the adjustment I need to make at this maneuver node here, at the intersection point, is going to be costing me more delta V than if it had been more orbits away, because it'll only accumulate over 2 orbits, the periodic change. 10 meters per second, well, it's not too bad. And I've got my Kerbin slingshot. Now, I'm not going to try and tweak that Kerbin slingshot from this far out. The game won't be able to predict it accurately enough. I'll wait till I actually get near this maneuver node, and then I'll plan my Kerbin intercept. This is the burn for Bob to send him on his way towards that Kerbin slingshot, and you might remember it's the opposite way from the way Jeb was going to go. And I don't quite have the node where I want, but I just burn a little more in a second here, and I'll push that node. There's the node, not quite at the intercept, just push that a little further around until it's exactly where I want it, and there it is. And so Jeb and Bob are finally going to depart from each other here, as Bob swings off to the right and Jeb swings off to the left. Bob, as I said, wants to go to Dres, but you can see that I've set up maneuvers to give him an apoapsis quite a long way above Dres. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is because if I capture or if I intercept Dres from my current periapsis, which is actually inside the periapsis of Kerbin, I'm going to be very elliptical. My orbit will be very eccentric, and so my delta V, or my relative velocity to Dres when I intercept it, will be very high, because Dres will be whizzing by and I'll be going very slowly. Instead, what I'm going to do is slingshot off Kerbin, pushing my apoapsis out to here, and then slingshot off Kerbin again. And the delta V, or the relative velocity after I push my periapsis up to Dres by using Joule, will be a much smaller relative velocity difference than the relative velocity difference I have coming up from below Kerbin to Dres. So we're actually going to go, to get to Dres, we've gone from Kerbin to Eve, back to Kerbin, and then we'll go to Jewel, and then finally to Dres, which should be the cheapest way I can figure, at least, of getting to Dres and landing on it. So I've got a few burns to perform here. First, Bob's burn to get that Kerbin slingshot, and then a fairly large burn for Jeb to push his periapsis down to Moho. And I will show every burn that I do, other than some 1 or 2 meter per second burns that are really inconsequential. They're just to avoid an unwanted gravity assist from one of the moons of Jewel or something like that. So if you keep an eye on the fuel and oxidizer levels on the top right of screen, you should see a very high degree of continuity, because just about every burn is shown, certainly any large burn, and even most of the fairly small burns. So Jeb has just left Moho, and I need to get him back to higher altitude eventually to get him to Jewel. Now my first step on that journey is going to be Eve. To do that though, you can see that Moho has pushed my orbital line, this solid blue line, outside of Eve's orbit, which is the highlighted target, so the yellow line right now, at the descending node. So right now I'm descending through Eve right about here, but there's a little separation there. So ideally I want to burn retrograde on the other side of the orbit there to bring this orbital line, my orbital line, down to Eve. The downside of that, unfortunately, is that right now I do have an intercept with Eve, but I have to burn prograde on the first maneuver. So that's maneuver 1 here. It's a prograde burn of 29 meters per second. Now, obviously, if I burn retrograde early on this side, I'm actually going to miss that intercept because I need my period to take longer, not shorter. So what I do is perform a slightly too large prograde burn. Then about 3 orbits later, I'm going to perform a retrograde burn, and then finally a very small normal correction. And that gives me a nice close periapsis to Eve. And if we then look beyond that maneuver, I want to hit Kerbin after hitting Eve. So let's see what's happening with Kerbin. Well, I've set my Eve escape, which is the dotted blue line, to cross Kerbin's, which is the light pale blue line, to cross Kerbin's orbit. And hopefully the ascending or descending node is right at that crossing. To find out, let's now set Kerbin as the target. And there's a crossing point between my orbit and Kerbin's orbit after my Eve slingshot, and the ascending node is right there. So that's looking pretty good. I will eventually set a maneuver there and start planning for a Kerbin intercept. And here are the burns for Jeb to get back to his Eve slingshot to take him past Kerbin, the prograde burn here, and then the retrograde burn. This one happened a couple of orbits later, and it will be followed up by that normal correction. And we're making our changes here a long way away from our intercepts, so very, very tiny changes make a very big difference. And you want to get as close to your plan as you possibly can. It'll never be perfect, but get it as close as you can. And when you move through SOI boundaries like I'm about to do here, make sure you drop your time warp value. Otherwise, at 100,000 times warp, at 50 times per second, you're moving about 5,000 kilometers every frame, assuming you're rendering it at 50 frames a second, at an orbital speed, a solar orbital speed of about what we've got here. So you can easily be 5,000 kilometers past the SOI boundary before the game recalculates your trajectory, which means you're going to be way off your plan. And that's why you want to drop your time warp as you pass through, or as you make SOI transitions. So there's Jeb's nice high apoapsis out past Dres and his Kerbin slingshot, and he's going to go for a second Kerbin slingshot that will take him to Jewel, and then we'll watch Bob do the same thing. He'll make a burn to get his first Kerbin slingshot and go for a second. And then we're actually going to leave Bob for a little while. It was a bit confusing to me editing the video to track both these guys and ping back and forth between them, so I thought it would be for the viewers as well. So we'll focus on Jeb for a while here, in a moment at least, and Jeb is going to be heading up to Jewel to start getting some science from the various moons of Jewel. And I have a bit of a problem with Jewel at the moment. I'm getting a slingshot off Kerbin, and it's getting me nice and high up to the altitude of Jewel, but I'm highly inclined, or my plane is much higher than Jewel's at that point, and there's not much I can do about that. My adjustment to get that slingshot is there, and if I just put one after that, I'll show you that there's really no normal burn that I can perform because it's just going to pivot kind of around Kerbin there, sort of through a line along an axis following my mouse here. So I can't actually lower this relative to Joule's plane. What I'm going to do instead is hit Duna on the way through at this point here after I leave Kerbin. And it's only a couple of orbits ahead that I get a nice intercept. You can see that coming up there. And what I'm hoping to do is pass over the north pole of Duna. It should fling me southwards, and now I'll pivot through this plane instead, through an axis that passes through that intercept, because that's where I'm effectively making a normal correction by passing over the north pole of Duna, and that will push this push my apoapsis down towards the plane of Joule. So we're through our Kerbin slingshot and we have our planned intercept with Duna. You can see how passing over the north pole of Duna here, and in fact Ike as well, but primarily Duna, has as planned dropped our inclination down into Joule's orbital plane, and I've been able to actually get the ascending node pretty much right at the Joule orbit. But Jeb still had a few burns he needed to perform to actually get his Joule intercept. First the burn to get him over the north pole of Duna here, and then the Joule intercept orbit. Now, there's one thing you need to know when you're heading for Joule, and that is this.
It is a silly place. Right.
And that's because Joule's inner moons of Leithval and Tylo pick you up in their SOIs so often and give you gravity slingshots that you actually don't want more than the ones that you do want. I think I miss recording the Joule aero brake here, but once I get into Joule orbit, which I am now, I'm actually going to perform a bunch of small gravity slingshots and a whole bunch of burns to avoid the ones I don't want and get the ones I do want. So it's a lot of burns, but they're not very big. My engine throttle's only at about 5% as I perform these burns, slowly working my way up to a pole apoapsis that is nice and wide, so it gives me a small relative velocity encounter, and here's finally getting that periapsis down at pole. And here things are a little bit hectic because Jeb still has a little fuel left in the first stage of his ship, but as soon as that runs out I want to separate it, overcook the solid rocket booster using fuel from a tank in the rear of the ship there, so still not wasting fuel from the final stage, and then complete the circularization burn. But I actually ran out of fuel while performing this circularization burn, so I'm a bit worried that I'm burning inefficiently and I end up overcooking the circularization. So I decided to just come directly in for a pole landing, and of course pole landings are pretty easy because of the low gravity. And as always, when I get to this point where I've landed on pole, I face a bit of a conundrum, and the conundrum is this. BOP is an expensive target because it's got a very high inclination. Now, one way I could get to BOP would be to loop around on pole's surface until I get to the ascending node through BOP, then leave pole with a bit of normal plus, or I could do it over there with some normal minus on my exit burn and try and get close to BOP's inclination, as well as pulling my periapsis down to BOP and get an intercept. But that is a very large inclination difference. So that's the direct method, and it's the easy method. It will take the least amount of time and requires the least amount of planning. But is it the cheapest? There are other options. For example, I could drop my periapsis all the way to Tylo and then use Tylo to shift my inclination, as well as pick my drop my apoapsis down to BOP. So I'd be going from Tylo to BOP instead of from pole to BOP. Kashua on the KSP official forum used Alex Munn's launch window calculator to show that the delta V directly from pole to BOP, including the necessary additional delta V for the inclination difference, is about the same as going from pole to Tylo and then using Tylo to adjust the inclination to BOP. So since pole to direct to BOP is simpler, I'm going to use that method. Now that means I'm going to want to leave pole at the ascending node of BOP. It also means that I want to leave retrograde relative to my pole orbit around Joule and normal plus retrograde relative to pole's orbit around Joule. And that means my landing site makes a difference, and I'll show you why that is. If I want to leave retrograde, ideally, well, one way I could do it would be to burn eastwards and wait till I come around to here and then start burning to get an escape trajectory. But then I won't have any normal component to my burn. It would be easier if I could just burn over the north or south pole. If I burnt hard north straight away, I'd leave with some normal plus, or I could burn over the south pole, and as I pass the south pole, then burn, and as pole bends me around, I'll gain some normal plus. But I also want to be leaving tangential to pole's orbit here, which would be in this direction. If I zoom in on pole, that would mean I would have to have landed right about here to pass directly over the pole and get that correct inclination. Landing here makes things a bit more complicated. I have to try and figure out what the best launch angle is to end up with an escape trajectory that is leaving tangentially retrograde to pole with some normal plus, if possible. I decided to leave in a southeasterly direction, thinking that I would wrap around and be heading off in the right direction and pick up a bit of science on my way up as well, because having just landed, I had a lot of science, a lot of electricity, I should say, in the pod, so a good time to do some transmissions. And here's the eventual exit burn. And that worked out fairly well. There's my planned maneuver. It's sending me out a little bit radial out relative to my resultant orbit, so not directly retrograde, but with a nice normal plus component that, as you can see there, is getting my inclination just a little further away from pole, a little closer to BOP, and with the right amount of retrograde velocity to bring my periapsis down around BOP's orbit. The way to focus on that kind of thing, by the way, set a maneuver and then focus yourself and tab through. The maneuvers will come up first in the list. So there's the ascending node right on the orbital line. So it's time to say goodbye to pole and head over to BOP. Again, putting the intersection point, the ascending node, right over the top of the orbital line of BOP here. And as I came in for BOP, I thought I was going to land right on the top of that mountain there. BOP's a bit of a tricky place to land on, very hilly place. And I thought the top of a mountain would be good, but the shadows kind of fooled me, and as it turned out, I was coming in right on the side of the mountain here. But I pitched the ship over to match the angle of the hill when I saw that this was happening, and came in for actually turned out to be a pretty safe landing in the end, and then it was time to plan for ELU. I'm still quite a ways out from the ascending node of ELU through Joule, but I'm coming up to a cheap time for Jeb to leave BOP to get to Tylo. Definitely cheaper to leave from here to drop my periapsis than it is from here to drop my periapsis. Going to be a bit hairy this launch, but shouldn't be too much of a problem. BOP's gravity is very, very small. Let's get that nose up. Phew, okay, so we made it, and it's time to go and head to Tylo, and then we'll spend a little while waiting for the ascending node of ELU and avoiding the moons of Joule, and eventually looking for an ejection from Joule that'll give me a cheap intercept with ELU. Now, given Joule's orbit, it's going to take a combination of 3 vectors tied together on the ejection. We're going to need a radial out, a prograde, and a normal plus vector. And it takes a bit of planning to put that all together. But Tylo is an excellent body to get gravity assists off. In fact, it's the best body, I would say, in the entire solar system, because it's so large, and without an atmosphere you can get really, really close to it, so you can have great control over your Joule ejections. Here you can see I found the Tylo slingshot that I was looking for a total of 30 meters per second. This node 2 is just to show the timing, and it's giving me that radial out, normal plus, and a prograde combination that I was looking for. and the resultant solar orbit is pretty good for a cheap insertion burn for an ELU intercept. You can see I've got that the angle's pretty close, the apoapsis is pretty much the same, my periapsis is a little lower, but overall that's going to be a low relative velocity intercept at this point here, which means a low delta V insertion burn. But there is a problem with this. If I leave Joule here while ELU's here with similar orbital periods, it's going to take a hell of a long time before we both meet up at this ascending node. Let's just see how long that would be. "68 years of solar orbit." Well, I've managed to find a different Tylo slingshot for a total of about 30 meters per second, 35 meters per second. I don't have as much normal plus as I had on my previous slingshot, but my resultant orbit is still very good. It's probably actually better in terms of my relative tangential velocity with ELU at intercept. The relative normal velocity will be somewhat higher. You can see my orbital plane is quite a long way below or off ELU's plane there. But the other advantage is it's a heck of a lot sooner at 15 years. Now that's still a long time, but it's a lot better than 60 years plus. And really it's just a product of where Joule and ELU are at the moment. There's not a lot I could do to make that sooner unless I did leave Joule into a very low solar orbit, look for another intercept and plan it all out again. And to be honest, I don't think I have the patience or the endurance to do all that planning again. So I'm going to go for this 15-year encounter at a relatively low cost, if I can get these burns right, of course. So here are Jeb's burns to get that slingshot off Tylo, and this is a set of high precision burns. I'm kind of threading the needle here, trying to avoid Joule's other moons. It takes about 3 orbits before I get to that slingshot out of Joule, and because it's so easy to get accidental slingshots off the other moons, those burns had to be very, very precise, but they were all very small. And something else you might have picked up from that 15-year encounter plan. The way this mission is possible is to exploit the one resource in Kerbal Space Program that is still infinite, in the stock game at least, and that is time. By planning things many, many orbits ahead, and in some cases many solar orbits ahead, obviously it takes a long time to complete the mission. In fact, the mission took, I think it was about 40 years to do the whole mission in Kerbal time, so on the mission elapsed time. And that might seem a bit ridiculous, but this whole concept is a bit ridiculous, so I don't really think that's a valid criticism, but anyway, it was just to prove that it could be done, right, in one launch. So with Jeb on ELU, and he's going to head back to Joule again, he's going to actually head from Joule down to Duna, and you'll see shortly that that's where Bob is going to be heading as well. And the reason why I decided to do that was because Bob and Jeb at this point had very similar amounts of fuel in their ships. Speaking of Bob, I'm going to leave Jeb here because it takes him a while to get to Duna. So we'll go back to Bob and see what Bob has been doing this whole time. So I'm performing Bob's Joule burn for his eventual intercept with Dres. Now clearly this doesn't look like an intercept with Dres. So what's going on here? Well, given the position where I was getting the intercept with Joule, I couldn't actually get the change to my orbit that I needed to give myself the inclination for Dres or the eventual periapsis for Dres. You can see that my eventual intersection point is not at the node, the descending node of Dres through Joule. It would have needed to have been over here somewhere. And the large radial escape component left me with an orbit that was, my apoapsis was actually above Joule and it was off-center compared to Dres. So what I've decided to do instead is to actually go in and aerobrake at Joule, leave myself a very high apoapsis so that I can stay away from all the other moons around Joule, and just loop around Joule a few times until I get to the second node, the ascending node of Dres through Joule around here, and then gravity slingshot off of either Lathe or Tylo. So I'm going to perform a very high altitude aerobrake around Joule, a bit over 130 kilometers, to leave my apoapsis right up high and giving me a lot of time away from the additional moons. Now I actually aerobraked a little bit too high, and I have to turn around and use a bit of fuel to finish off the orbit, but that's probably a good thing in the end, because it means I can have the apoapsis as high as I possibly can, and I'm just checking that the orbits ahead of me for a few orbits here are clear, so I'm not getting any unwanted slingshots. Moving around to the node through Dres, so I make my orbit a little more coplanar with the other moons, burning normal at the apoapsis where it's cheap, and then another aerobrake to bring the apoapsis down and get that slingshot. It turns out to be a slingshot off Lathe that's giving me that intersect with the orbit of Dres there, and flying past. Looks like Kerbin, but no, that's Lathe. And as Bob was leaving Joule to get to Dres, you can see Jeb was just arriving at Joule for the first time. So I can't remember exactly how much time has elapsed in the mission at this point, but I think it was probably somewhere about 5 or 6, maybe 7 years when Jeb got his first Joule encounter. So it's taken a long time to get here. And was it worth it? Was it worth sending Bob on his crazy journey to get to Dres, or should I have just gone to Dres straight away? Well, as I come into Dres in a moment here, you'll notice that as I arrive, my orbital speed when I get to the Dres periapsis is about 1,000 meters per second. Now, if you come up from Kerbin, it's going to be about 1,600 meters per second, and I was actually coming up from even lower than Kerbin, so it would have been actually somewhat higher than that, which means I've saved about 600 meters per second, probably a little more than that, on the insertion. And it did cost me some fuel to make all those slingshots to get from Kerbin to Eve to Kerbin, and then to Joule, and then back to Dres. But it certainly did not cost me 600 meters per second to do that. So all in all, I reckon, I'm estimating here, but I think I probably came out about probably 400 to maybe 500 meters per second ahead. So definitely worthwhile. Anyway, there's only one target left on the mission, so we're coming into the home stretch here, and that final target is Duna, or really the Duna system, both Duna and Ike. And both Bob and Jeb are going to use dual slingshots to get to Duna, so that's why I'm sending Bob up to Joule instead of straight down to Duna, and just making sure I have a good intercept with Joule. Now, my Joule slingshot to Duna has to be a powered slingshot. I'm going to perform an assisted slingshot, and you can see why that's happening here. So the ejection angle I have for Joule, if you look at the top right of screen where the encounter is going to occur, the ejection angle that would be retrograde would be down and to the right, and if I move it anywhere from the current ejection angle, my periapsis was actually shifting up a little bit, so that way is retrograde and that way is retrograde, so they're lined up. What I'm actually going to do is click it in a couple of notches, and then I'll actually perform a burn at periapsis at Joule, which will widen that ejection angle and point it more retrograde. But I thought it was going to cost me too much, that the assisted gravity slingshot was going to cost me about 100 meters per second. So at first I thought I'd go and aero capture and then sling off Lathe or Tylo again, but as I got closer, I managed to set up some maneuvers that actually gave me a Duna encounter. And I wasn't willing to wait and spend the time to plan it all again. So yes, it cost me about 100 meters per second to perform this assisted gravity slingshot, but it saves me a lot of time in flying the mission. And at this point, as you might imagine, I was getting a bit tired of flying this mission. This is about 8 hours in. So this is the actual burn, and you can see it's widening my ejection angle here when I perform the burn. And so my ejection angle is as retrograde relative to my solar orbit here as possible, and I'm just lowering that down to cross Duna's orbital plane, and there's the intercept. Now of course, to get Bob landed on Duna, I'm going to perform an aero capture, and I'm always surprised about how low an altitude you need to aero capture at Duna. This is about 10 kilometers is my periapsis altitude here, and it doesn't quite put me into a captured orbit, but again, it means I can burn my engines at the apoapsis to fix my inclination, because I want to get a pretty equatorial landing site here, and I actually perform multiple aero brakes, pushing my periapsis a little higher each time to circularize around Duna as much as possible before coming in for the landing here, which means my re-entry speed is low, and I can take advantage of the drag as much as possible when coming in for this landing. And once I've landed at Duna, I have a quick glance at my fuel level, and it is about 421 units of fuel here. So This is Jeb doing a very similar maneuver at Jewel, a powered gravity slingshot. And the question was, how much was Jeb going to have, and could perhaps Jeb land on Ike instead of Bob? And so this is the spreadsheet I had to put together to check that. So if you look at the top, there's me figuring out the weight of a unit of fuel and so forth. On the left is the ship, and down the bottom is the required burns to get from Ike back to Kerbin. So we add up all of these burns here and we get a required delta V of 1420, and according to my math I had a total delta V of about 1800, so the answer was yes, I could get Jeb to land on Ike in place of Bob. And that is very fortunate, because as Jeb comes in for his powered slingshot past Jewel, he ends up with just a little less fuel than Bob has in the tank right now, and Bob is still sitting on the surface of Duna. There's no way that Bob was going to make it to Ike, so it's a good thing that Jeb was going to be able to make it to Ike, and it's amazing how close the numbers were in the end. Anyway, as Jeb arrives at the Duna system, he is also going to perform multiple aerobraking passes. I again didn't quite get my apoapsis down into the SOI, but I had to perform a few small burns to avoid unwanted Ike intercepts before performing this intercept, which is not actually going for a landing, but you'll see the result is an orbit that's very similar to Ike's orbit and offset a little bit. And if anyone knows if this is worth doing before actually coming in for the intercept for landing in order to make the relative velocity lower, let me know. I don't know if that's actually worth it, but I think it might be. And then with Jeb landed on Ike and Bob landed on Duna, I was wondering who to send where, so I decided to put Jeb into Ike orbit and then send Bob to meet up with Jeb. I figured he certainly did have fuel to at least do that. So Jeb's going into a very equatorial orbit around Ike, and fortunately Bob is landed very equatorially on Duna, as you can see in the background there. And that means that when I send Bob off to Ike to meet up with Jeb, I shouldn't have to make too much of an inclination change. So Bob is here launching from Duna, and another thing I'm not sure of is the best descent profile from Duna. I burnt somewhat vertically to about 3,000 or 4,000 meters before turning pretty hard over to horizontal, and I figured that seemed to work out okay. I didn't actually check to see if my launch trajectory here was actually close to 1,300 or maybe 1,500 meters per second, but getting pretty low on fuel, as you can see at this point on the top right, so enough for a circularization. But then did I have enough to capture at Ike? Well, again, I thought I'll try and do the best I can here by getting an orbit around Ike, an intercepted Ike that puts me into an orbit around Duna that is similar to Ike's, as you see there, and then burn after that resultant orbit into an Ike capture. And I'm going to eventually set Jeb as a target. Now you can see the two orbital planes here are pretty close together. They're not perfect, so after I close that orbit off, I find the ascending node and burn through that to match it up a little better. We're pretty close already, and as I burn here to circularize a little bit, you'll see the closest approach wind around like a clock, and eventually I wind it around until I think the relative velocity is going to be low enough that I'll be able to make that intercept without flying by and missing it. And it's obviously a very close approach. So Bob is here just adjusting his trajectory to keep himself close to Jeb, have the orbits about the same. Bob does make it to Jeb, and check the fuel level here. As I come into Jeb, the relative velocity is 3 meters, 1 meter, 0.5 meters per second. And I've run out of fuel. So with a 0.5 meters per second difference in relative velocity, I just switched to Jeb to finish that off. So I was amazed at how close that was and how perfectly in a way that kind of worked out. And then I had to transfer all the science from Bob's vessel to Jeb's vessel. Now I don't know if I lose some science by doing this. Maybe I do, because my total was actually less than I thought it would be in the end. But I know I lose the science for not returning the ship that's landed on another celestial body, which is worth a little bit of science, but I'm not sure if I've lost any more. There are a lot of things I couldn't put in Jeb's ship because I already had them in Jeb's ship, like science from around Jewel and so forth. But I don't know, so if anyone knows, I took the surface samples obviously, and all the crew reports had already been sent. So if anyone knows why else I might have lost science by transferring from one ship to the other, I'd be curious if you could answer in the comments below. Or maybe I actually didn't lose any and I just overestimated what I would come back with. And oh my god, we're done. We're going home. The last correction back to Kerbin, and I actually still had some fuel left over, so there you go. And the question is, did I earn enough to unlock the entire tech tree here? Well, you'll see in a minute that I actually missed a couple of science reports that I could have gotten. Somehow I managed to miss I think an EVA report over Duna as well as an EVA report over Joule. But the total was 10,559 science points. So to find out whether that's enough to unlock the whole tree, I guess we'll just go to the Research and Development Center and check that. So here we go.